Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Marta Dziurosz. I am a Polish literary translator and a member of the TA committee, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you here tonight. And we are also historically live streaming the the TA AGM panel discussion for the first time. So, did I just do something to my mic? So welcome, everyone watching globally, I think. And welcome to our discussion entitled, Who Are We? Who Could We Be? Widening Access to Literary Translation. So I will introduce my guests. To my extreme left is Kareem Abdulrahman, who is a translator and a journalist. He worked for 8 years with the BBC, where translation from Kurdish was part of his job. His translation of Bakhtiar Ali's I Stared at the Night of the City, the first Kurdish novel to be translated into English, was published in 2016. And his next translation, The Last Pomegranate, also by Ali, is due out next year. He lives in London. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
To the right of Kareem is Oka. So Oka, or Khairani Barokka, is an Indonesian writer, poet, and artist whose work has been presented extensively in 15 countries. Among her honors, she is Modern Poetry in Translation's inaugural poet in residence and a UNFPA Indonesian young leader driving social change. Her books are Rope and Indigenous Species, and she is co-editor of Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back. Her most recent exhibition is Anna, Nomenclature at the ICA. Oka works multilingually and has about 21 years of professional translation experience, having started her career as an Indonesian to English translator for print news media in her teens. Thank you for coming, Oka. And to the right of Oka and to the left of me is Charlotte Ryland, a freelance Germanist, editor, translator, and researcher who is dedicated to promoting language learning, multilingualism, and literary translation, in particular as director of the Stephen Spender Trust and founding director of the Translation Exchange at the University of Oxford. Both organizations aim to engage people of all ages and backgrounds in literary translation, to move away from traditional language hierarchies and to bring inspiring translation activities into UK schools. Welcome. So just to start, and by way of a bit of an introduction, in terms of translator diversity, of course, there are schemes within the UK literary translation industry which are open to everyone, such as the Writers' Centre Norwich Translation Mentorship and Summer School. And for example, English Pen's Pen Translates program explicitly invites submissions that increase the diversity of British publishing literary landscape. But recently we've seen an emergence of mentorships and residencies aimed specifically at, for example, the BAME translators in case of the Tilted Axis Press funded mentorship with Writers' Centre Norwich, and residency aimed at so-called L2 translators at the Scottish Centre Cove Park. In America, there's the Iowa Arts Fellowship for Diversity and the Alta Travel Fellowship for an emerging translator of color or working from an underrepresented diaspora or stateless language. I'm sure you probably will have seen it, but the winter 2019 issue of In Other Words had a whole section devoted to diversity and translation, including 2 excellent pieces on English translators of various ethnicities and linguistic backgrounds by Esther Kim and Francisca McNeil, both very worth reading, and Ayça Turkoglu and Mui Popoksakul also contributed wonderful writing on the topic in other issues of In Other Words. So there's work out there that's being done. Just to say at the end, recommended reading, Kitchen Table Translations, an anthology that I was very inspired by when preparing this event edited by Madhu Kaza, a wonderful selection of reading of translations from diaspora and heritage languages. Sorry, I will shut up in a short moment. I just have one more thing to say. A message from Kate Griffin at National Center for Writing. So, Charlotte, you mentioned the Visible Communities project, but we weren't live streaming back then, so I will repeat some of what you said. So the National Center for Writing is looking for all of your help with a program called Visible Communities. It's a program exploring literary translation in diaspora and heritage language communities, supported by Arts Council England. Our partners include the British Centre for Literary Translation, the Queen's College Translation Exchange Oxford, the Stephen Spender Trust, New Writing North, the Poetry Translation Centre, and writer and translator Kavita Banot. As well as carrying out research and mapping into what is already happening across the country, we are working on a range of projects, including translation in schools and poetry translation, and we are looking into ways of supporting literature and translation within the Punjabi community. We will also, so we, of course, not me, but National Center for Writing, will be offering mentoring opportunities, bursaries, and residencies to UK-based BAME literary translators. So the researcher associated with the project, Charlotte Hallahan, would like to interview UK-based BAME literary translators, particularly those working with heritage languages. So any TA members who are willing to be involved, please get in touch with Kate Griffin, on kate@nationalcenterforwriting.org.uk. So if you know anyone who could be interested, or if you're interested yourself, please do write to Kate. I'm sure Charlotte and Kate would very much appreciate your input. I'm done now. My first question to all of you, and some of the questions will be for specific people, but everyone please feel free to pitch in whenever you have something to say. Let's start with the basics, and please, if you could tell me, what does diversity in and wide access to literary translation mean to all of you? Just a simple one, just to get you going.
Just a softball.
Who's ready to start?
Well, I feel like I've been put on the spot.
No.
To me, I think it means the access to the largest number of languages and different literary traditions from different parts of the world. And we know, although things have been improving in the translation industry in the past few years, but I think there's still a long way to go in terms of representing various languages and traditions. For one, I myself translate from Kurdish, and there's very little translation from Kurdish into English, and that's something maybe we'll get into in the rest of the event.
Sure. Okay.
For me, going along with work that all of us are involved in, access to brings to mind equanimity and equality of access to the ability to translate, to the products of our work, to as many different communities as possible, and transparency within that process, which is not always something that's a thing in Indonesia, and I'm sure we'll come to that as well.
Yeah. So are you saying that there are inequalities in access to transparency as well within translation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, it's partly about the widest range of languages, but also about the socioeconomic backgrounds of those who are translating and also those who are reading the translations. I guess in my work, there's a particular focus at the moment on diaspora languages in the UK and those becoming more prominent in the translation world.
Okay. We might as well talk about it more then, while we're here. So the work that you do with translators with schools, for example, could you say, to what extent do you think that early exposure to literary translation as a profession early on helps to widen the pool of people that we have working as literary translators later on?
Yeah.
And I think interest is not enough. There also need to be structures supporting those young translators throughout their careers. What sort of structures do there need to be for that interest to merge into actually doing the work and being able to do the work?
Yes, Very good questions, and questions that I am grappling with at the moment, because that's exactly the issue, is that so just very brief background. For about the past 18 months, I've had the great pleasure of running the Stephen Spender Trust, which in, I think, about 2010, set up a program initially called Translation Nation, which was about translators going into schools and enabling groups of primary children to translate folk tales that they brought in from home in a range of languages. And it was a 3-day program, and it ended up with them performing their translations. So it was a really collaborative, performative experience. It had fantastic feedback. May I read a quote that I found today when I was thinking about this? So this was a primary teacher talking about Translation Nation. And the effect on the kids. They are not as shy or afraid to share their languages with their classes. 2 Somalian children would not even admit that they spoke a language other than English until they took part in the project. By the end, they were correcting people and directing people in speaking their language, which was great for them and also for the rest of the class. More than great, I think, because that is, yeah, amazing. So out of that came a program that is now the kind of umbrella for everything that we do in the education world, which is Translators in Schools. Does what it says on the tin. It's about getting translators into schools. There's another lovely quote from recent work where a great educator called Cheryl Moskowitz did a workshop, despite not knowing any Urdu, did a workshop on Urdu poetry with a group of secondary pupils. And the teacher said it's important that the students can see themselves in the literature that they read. Translating this Urdu poem together gave them the opportunity to do so. So that was another one that I thought really highlighted what the value of this is. So the basic idea of translators in schools is that there is a translator who goes into a school, and of course there are all sorts of kind of aspirational elements of that for the kids, that they see what sort of an exciting life you can have as a translator, and the travel and the kind of variety, and ideally it gives them an insight into what they can do with their languages. And from my perspective, it doesn't matter whether that's a language that they speak at home or a language that they've learnt in school. It's really just about valuing languages in all forms and all levels of languages as well. Where we are now with our education work is trying to set up structures that make it sustainable. Because I think I can't answer your question, what is the impact on the profession, because all the feedback that we have is anecdotal like that. It's all really positive. But you know, it's kind of we don't have any like longitudinal studies of people who've gone through and have they become literary translators. But we do have a lot of feedback from teachers who say that they want support in integrating this, and a lot of frustration with with the curriculum, both on the English side and on the modern languages side, and how little culture there is as a whole, especially in the modern languages side. So we are looking at ways of embedding translation in the classroom. And really that has to mean that there can't always be a translator in the school. We're not going to change the name, I don't think, but the translators might work closely with the teacher so that the teacher can then take forward that kind of work in a more sustained way. And we also run the Stephen Spender Prize for Poetry Translation. I had something to wave, thanks. I will actually wave it because I brought lots of copies with me. These arrived from the printers today, and I brought some that I do not want to take home with me, so I will put them somewhere at the end. And this has youth categories, and what we're trying to do now is to turn the prize into something that helps those education programs to sustain, so that it's an annual longer term project that lots of pupils can engage in, that we really make it clear that it is all languages, it's not just like Greek, Latin, French and German, that we help teachers to integrate it into what they're doing, so that it's basically a nice aspirational way of getting literature in other languages into the classroom. And I think it has to start there, really, if we want to create a new generation of more diverse translators. The best place to start is with 10-year-olds, I think.
Okay. And
well, or maybe at 5-year-olds, but we're currently starting
early,
with 10-year-olds.
Early.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So obviously, those students that you work with are from all around the world. And I think the literary translators, living in the UK or globally, even if they do still translate into English, they do have various histories of the languages that they have come into, or the languages that they have learned, the languages they live with, the languages they work with. And I think some of them, they diverge from that, what seems to me like a standard of someone born into an English-speaking country, picked up another language at some point, and then started translating from that language into English. There are so many linguistic histories and biographies out there, and I was wondering if we could talk about the status of those translators in the translation industry. Oka and Kareem, do you think that there is something? Is it even useful to speak of them as a separate group?
I think that in speaking about, I guess, the demographics of translations, right, of translators, right? I mean, what I love about your projects is that it is really democratic, right? And it's saying that there's language parity between languages. There's no hierarchy of languages. There's no hierarchy of who's more likely to be a translator than another person. But I think in real world terms, I think there is still, unfortunately, a colonial mindset of a person born in an English-speaking country learns another language and is an expert on that language and culture, and oftentimes will be consulted over people who actually come from that language and culture. And there is, I think, I observe, there's still Orientalism within that, right? And there's still a differential in terms of what languages are considered literary, and and speaking philosophically, what forms are considered literary translation, right? What I loved about your work that you're talking about is you're taking kids' oral histories from home, right? And that is really important because, a lot of oral cultures were and continue to be wiped out by the written word, because the written word was what, colonialist created laws from. So that contributes to language extinction, obviously. And when we only focus on literary translation as being in forms that the West understands and Western markets understand, the book form, the short story collection, the novel, even the play, for instance, I'm trying to think how you would translate, in Indonesia, in Javanese culture, for instance, there are wayang shadow puppetry, right? Shows that run all night in the village. And I'm trying to think, can that be marketable or in translation in another form? Because what we're really talking about is understanding communal context, right? For how these stories and these forms of literature, in which oral literature forms are so vast and varied, right? And also being diminished all the time by these markets, these scent markets. Talking about the communal histories of those and what context you want to bring them in, and where these are really complex dynamics that I think are often put to the wayside, and especially when it comes to deaf and disabled languages in general. I mean, I'm just thinking about the divide between BSL translators not being considered as literary translators. Whereas, every single BSL or British Sign Language translator or American Sign Language translator or Bisindo, which is the Indonesian Sign Language, or Katakolok, which is a sign language found in one village in Bali, right? They've developed their own sign language, and whenever a sign language interpreter comes into a space and interprets a poem, that is literary translation. And yet think about the infrastructure, right? When it comes to funding, when it comes to grants, when it comes to classification of any form, in which these translators who are very highly skilled, it takes so much time to learn sign languages, are not considered literary translators, right? So it's not just who can we include, but what are we including them into, and why can't we widen our understanding of who are already literary translators, right? Kids in the home sharing stories that they heard from their grandmother's language. I'm not fluent in Bahasa Minang, which is my grandmother's language, but stories from that culture are translated from my mother to me in Indonesian, which I then translate into English. So this is also a form of literary translation. But I think when we privilege the written word, and also in terms of how the industry sees literary translation, I always think about what might get lost in translation. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't intend to. That wasn't a layup to this point. I wish. But yeah, all right.
We got there.
I should stop
We
now.
got
I
there.
think I'll stop. Okay.
Thank you. Kareem, anything now that we've jumped the shark and lost things in
I'm so
translation? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think this is a really deeply political question as well as cultural and philosophical, because I just tell you a little anecdote. When a few years ago, before I translated my first book, I wrote a review for a Kurdish novel, and a literary agent got in touch with me and he asked if I knew any professional literary Kurdish translators. And I said, well, no Kurdish novel has been translated into English, so that probably tells you the story. And he still insisted, but no, I want professionally. I said, but there hasn't been any. So how can you have professional literary translators if fiction, the easiest form to translate often, hasn't been translated? So, of course, there are all sorts of reasons why, for example, in the case of Kurdish, why not enough Kurdish literature hasn't been translated into English. I mean, I don't need to tell you much about what's going on right now on the Turkish-Syria border to know what's going on and what that means for the language, for the development of the language, and for the institutions that could eventually try to foster that kind of relationship. So you need translators, you need institutions, you need resources, you need funding. These are just the basic building blocks before you can have a translator. And in the case of many minority languages like Kurdish, where it's a language, the speakers of Kurdish all live in countries where they are minority, it's obvious they are always going to be second class when it comes to institutional attention, if you like.
Yeah.
So that makes things a bit complicated, yeah.
I read your piece in Other Words about translating the first Kurdish novel to appear in English, which was translated by you. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about you started talking about this, the obstacles that you encountered when trying to translate the book.
Yeah, well, you have all the obstacles that all translators have, regardless of what language they translate from. But then you just have to add a few more. For example, there aren't recognized Kurdish English dictionaries you can consult. There are a few, but they are just not good enough in terms of their quality. Interestingly, the one that I really like is a really short one, only 120 pages, written by an Englishman and a Kurdish academic from the 60s, which has been out of print for 50 years now. And so now when I come across a problem, how you translate a certain phrase or word or full sentence, I have to do a much larger research than anyone else. So one route is I speak Arabic and a little bit of Persian. Sometimes is to see what would be the equivalent in Persian and Arabic to which there are better resources from Kurdish, and see how that works. The longer route is to talk to my stepdaughter who was born here and say, look, if you were in this situation, there's a girl, there's a boy, she says, how would you express that? And whatever, you know, like, or talk to other native speakers and try to gauge the best way of expressing yourself. So that's just at the literal level of day-to-day translation. Then the other obstacles are to do with, obviously, the lack of institutions to support you, the lack of a larger pool of translators. Like, for example, if you're translating from most of the European languages, you know half a dozen translators at least, and you can just send an email and say, you know, I have this expression, and do some brainstorming and see what other people think. But in my case, I know very few Kurdish English translators. There are linguists, but they haven't done translation, let alone translation in the context of fiction. So it's often, if translation in general is a lonely job, it is extremely lonely when you translate from Kurdish in that case. But then I think, like, in a way it's more interesting because you have to do a bigger research, involving native speakers on both sides of the language
Yeah.
divide. So sometimes I find myself calling my mum and asking her about, I don't know, whatever type of clothes this woman were wearing and what's it made of. So I can then explain it to an English native speaker who is good in fashion or whatever it is and see what they
Yes.
what they call it.
So you become the dictionary, essentially.
Yeah,
Wow.
essentially.
Fantastic. Yes?
No, I think this question of institutional support is really important. Because one thing I wanted to mention was a really good report by that was called. It's called something like "Translating the Literatures of the Small European Nations."
Yes.
You were involved
yes.
with it.
I wasn't, but
You're
I admire
mentioned.
it very. Admire?
Yeah, you are. Anyway, I'm sure you are. And I really recommend it if you haven't read it already. There's a short report. It was a research project, I think, run from UCL, and then I think the book is about to come out. That is the kind of result of the bigger project, and there were lots of takeaways for me from that. But one of them was about, I think they use the word implicit competition between countries and between national institutes, and that is something that, because before what I'm doing now, I ran a project called New Books in German for 10 years, which obviously does what it says and promotes German language literature, and that I always wanted to do more collaboration, but there was no capacity in that project to do that really. But that always seemed to me that's what was lacking was, you know, we're not trying to, like, the German translation advocates aren't trying to steal readers away from the Swedish translation advocates. We're all we should all be working together to grow the readership for literature in translation or international literature or whatever you want to call it. And I guess then that there's an additional dimension if it's a language from which there are very few translators and where there isn't much institutional support, then there's more of a need for it. But I think that support could come from other institutions and from networks of institutions.
No, that's a very good point. For example, I was lucky enough to be on a BCLT mentorship scheme a few years ago. Sean Whitehead, who is here, he was my mentor, and I'm saying I was lucky because I think that was the first year where they started to introduce non-specific languages. So my mentor didn't need to speak my language to be able to help me, both to introduce me to the industry, but also to give me general tips on editing, on writing well, and what have you. And also, another way of overcoming some of these problems, in a way, it forced me to look towards co-translation. So I'm working with a friend of mine. Her name is Melanie. She used to be a BBC editor for 20 years, and when she retired, she started translating from Russian, French, and Greek recently. So I've been working with her. So before I send off my translation to the publisher, usually I'll run it by her, and there will be a conversation between us about the things we might want to change. And this has helped me greatly in terms of basically, I've got more extended support than if I just went directly to a publisher and worked with their in-house editor.
I think the political context of that whole situation was something that was, correct me if I'm wrong, quite important to you, Olka, when you were writing your fascinating essay against Terra Nullius translation, which you wrote for Modern Poetry in Translation.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit about what prompted you to write it and what is it all about?
Okay, so this year I'm in residence at Modern Poetry in Translation, and as part of that I wrote a couple of essays along with translating, and those essays are online on the MPT website if you'd like to see them. The first was called Against Terra Nullius Translation, and it came because, so this residency also ties in with the fact that Indonesia, my country, was, as you know, London Book Fair's target market focus for this past year, right? And there were a lot of conversations behind the scenes between myself and fellow writers and translators about a lot of lack of transparency of resources. There was no way to find out how to get our books even displayed. There was, you know, real mirroring of inequity and all sorts of real injustices that are present within the Indonesian literary scene. And all of this was happening behind the scenes. So I'd have like really long phone calls with like Tiffany Tsao or Norman Pasaribu, who both came to LBF. And at some point, Tiffany said, I think I'm gonna write something on Twitter about this. I was like, okay, I was expecting like 1 or 2 tweets. She wrote this massive tweet, which I think a bunch of you have read. And I was like, wow. And that isn't even everything that we talked about, but it sort of gives you an idea of, you know, how Indonesia was portrayed in the London Book Fair was only 12 writers were selected, and their, you know, committee, there was some talk in the committee of, we only selected Indonesians who were also fluent in English so that it wouldn't look bad in the media, which, I mean, like, you know, and there was no way for an Indonesian to even apply to be like one of these representative arbitrary 12 authors. Who was invited to which panels, and again, this was all really reflective of inequities and systemic biases and systemic abuses of power that have been happening for a very long time in the Indonesian literary scene. And so Tiffany and I decided to write twin essays, because I had an essay deadline coming up for modern poetry and translation. And out of that came Against Tyrannia's Translation, which is basically sort of my philosophical manifesto on this sense of, Indonesia, market focus, like untouched territory. Let us, you know, Heart of Darkness, discover this country where there hasn't been anything going on. There's nobody been, like, you know, just misrepresentations about what kind of translation was going on. A real limiting of, you know, like, let's just say there was a literary circle that said, this is the Indonesian canon. Whereas Indonesia is made up of hundreds of different languages. There is no such thing as the Indonesian literary scene or Indonesian canon, because it is made up of hundreds and hundreds of different cultures, of literary forms, of languages. And it was just it was really upsetting, actually, to witness that. And then Tiffany's paired essay was on electric literature, which is published at exactly the same time, and there are links to each essay within each other. So, which she talked more about basically the nitty-gritty of what was wrong about what was going on. What are the injustices that are happening here? And how should we not rely on just one Western sort of expert on our country to define what, you know, Indonesia is the 4th largest population in the world. We have so many incredible works that have yet to be translated and really rich histories from each of these cultures. And you're narrowing it down and you're making it impossible for people to, you know, when Tiff's article especially was published, a lot of people were like, well, you're finally saying what it's been so difficult for people to accomplish. I had to circumvent a lot of structures to be able to achieve the things that I have, because there's a lot of institutional sexism, and frankly, yeah, like it's sort of a glorification of Western expertise on Indonesia, right? And saying that there's only one outfit that does translation from Indonesia into English, which is not true. There's, for instance, Intersastra, which Tiffany and our friend Eliza Fitri Handayani, who's also a writer and translator. It's a grassroots effort to try and, as you do, you know, democratize literary translation and get more and more people involved. Whereas before it was really, you know, people who say there's, you know, only certain literary translators, and you have to, it's sort of a very elitist, difficult path to get to that road, was really exclusionary. So that's all out in the open now, some of it at least. So I encourage you to read those essays. But Against Tyrannia's Translation is really about, you know, this misrepresentation of Indonesia that happens a lot, and it's something that we were talking about at LBF, not in an interdisciplinary way. Our colleague Intan Paramadita, who wrote Apple and Knife, short story collection out with Bro Book, she's also was at London Book Fair, and is also somebody that we discussed a lot of these things with. She and I were talking, and she got to talking about her concept of, you know, the theory of discovery, which she wrote about she's a film and media studies scholar. So she had written articles about how Joshua Oppenheimer's documentaries, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, were very much, this genocide happened in Indonesia. Nobody was talking about it before. I'm this white man, I'm going in, I'm discovering everything. And by the way, those films were also co-directed by Anonymous, who is an Indonesian person, who I think I know the identity of. But anyway, so this just, you know, the sense that apart from that, nothing was happening. So speaking about mirroring those films, actually, those films kind of portray this genocide happened and there was no resistance, right? Whereas my parents met as activists. They've been activists their whole lives. And this, dictatorship of Suharto ended when I was 13. There has always been resistance. That's why there's always been disappearings and murders and all of this stuff, is because there has always been resistance. And yet, we are so often filtered down to this very narrow definition of what Indonesia is, what literary cultures there are, especially able normative cultures. Deaf and disabled cultures are really marginalized. And I just really wanted to say that's bullshit. It's really bullshit. And we were all really kind of sick of the oversimplification of things through a very, through a bias in power. So that's what that's about.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah, and that's the other side of the institutional coin.
That's what I was going to say, yes. Yeah.
And and it's something that's even an issue with German as well, although less so, I think. But they're the ones with the money often, and therefore the power to make these things happen. But that does mean that they also have the power to kind of impose the canon and impose a certain perspective on a country's literature. There needs to be counterbalance to that in the sort of grassroots, in the target culture, I guess.
Yeah. Kareem, I just wanted to go back to that issue of if we're talking about institutions. So I think it would be good to talk about the experience of translators who don't have that national institute funding their work. I assume that also means that that puts a limitation in terms of class and I guess income band on potential literary translators, because you have to have a different source of income, or you have to, I assume that being a full-time Kurdish literary translator, is that something that's even feasible?
Not at all. I mean, I think that's not highly unusual, because I think even for the established languages, there are very few people who can only live on translation, if you like. There are only very few full-time translators. But in the case of Kurdish, obviously, you need to have that as your second, if not third, job, if you like, because there isn't enough institutional support from anywhere, if you like. And of course, that will make things harder, and that just means that the next generation of translators, it will take much longer for them to come on into the scene.
What do we do about this? Can you, Charlotte, talk about a project that you're working on within an institution, the Queen's College Translation Exchange?
Yeah.
Does that have to do with supporting translators?
That's actually a good question. So the Queen's College Translation Exchange is we're calling it mainly an outreach centre that I've set up at a college that I was a lecturer in German at for a long time. And it's kind of bringing together the two sides of my life, because I was very involved in the university and also very involved in outreach and access initiatives at the university. And also through New Books in German, very involved in literary translation, and I became convinced that the way to promote languages is through translation, and that it's also a very good way to promote studying and going to university, because it's a really interactive, collaborative, intellectual, creative exercise. And so I got seed funding from the college to set up this thing that we're calling the Translation Exchange, which is very inspired by the Stephen Spender Trust. But I set it up before I became director of the Stephen Spender Trust. So now I have these two hats, which often are the same hat, and it's a little bit confusing. But we are focusing in particular on work with schools, and we're training university students to go into schools and do translation workshops, which are inspired by translators in schools. And we also have an international book club for reading books in translation. And the idea of that is to find the readers and then get them reading more diverse literature. And we're hoping to partner with libraries and bookshops so that we can because really it's a lot about going beyond the university, beyond
Yeah.
the walls.
Yeah.
And so partnering, so finding people who are already engaging in literature, but not necessarily in international literature. And yeah, there's a couple of other kind of schools initiatives. I guess, I mean, in terms of, it's not so much about helping translators, it's more about trying to continue to raise the profile of literary translation as an activity and to get more people reading and engaging in international literary culture, and especially young people, in the hope that they will grow up to be readers of international and translators of international literature.
Super, wonderful, thank you. Okay, I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned, sort of you touched on briefly before. Another recent piece of writing of yours that I read was With Care for Pen Transmissions. Would you be happy to talk about ableism in the translation industry? You sort of started mentioning it a little bit. Do you think what do we do? How?
Right. So the essay With Care, which I did write for Pen Transmissions recently, is about how structural ableism manifests in the translation industry. And the way I see it, there are three basic ways that it manifests for me that I have observed. The first is in terms of access to spaces, both online and offline, in terms of how accessible are the buildings where we hold meetings, where we have, book fairs, where we have book shops, where we, conduct our business, where we negotiate with lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. So the actual infrastructure. And then also online, obviously, whether websites are accessible, what, captions are there, et cetera. And the second part of that, apart from infrastructure, is also the content of literature. Because using, blind spot is pervasive. Using tone deaf or deaf to or mute as metaphors is pervasive. Using the words lame, crazy, etc. is super pervasive. And honestly, I'm just really tired of reading it. And people don't even realize how ableist it is. And yet it's really difficult to get through a lot of works in translation, even ones that are garlanded, because of the ableist content of the tropes that are used, for instance. There, in the past, I've worked also as a sensitivity reader and as a disability consultant. So I've consulted, for instance, for the British Council and done sensitivity readings for instance, authors who have taken on a work of translation. And it's funny, one past client was like, oh, I think I've just realized that one of the short stories in this collection that I'm translating is really ableist. Could you read it and let me know? And I gave her my report and I was like, this is so bad. This is like, it's basically comparing disabled people to demons. It's really bad. But at that point, and then we discuss, what are the steps when you know that, because that's a dilemma for this person, right? Because you've already agreed to translate this. So in this essay, I argue that we should all act as sensitivity readers for ourselves when we're translators, or hire someone if we really feel out of our depth, because in the process of reducing harm through our creations and through other people's creations and handling them with care, it's complicated sometimes because you want the literature of your country to be disseminated, of course. But I do think an honest way is to, authors can learn too. And maybe from that, if you can co-write something about that process, or whether or not you decide to leave a story in or not, or what is that? That's all valuable. And I think that should be made more public, right? Or even if you go as anonymous, at least knowledge sharing in some way, because there are these dilemmas that I found in the past with my work. So that's two ways. And then also in the sense of, I think also, in the sense of excluding deaf and disabled people from becoming literary translators, and also marginalizing deaf and disabled languages, as I've discussed previously. So those are the three ways that I see it being really pervasive and being something we really need to address, because there's another essay I wrote for Poetry Review last year called Translation of / as Absent Sanctuary Weapon, where I quote, I believe Amanda Boggs's famous video in my language, or in our language, which is on YouTube, and she's an autistic activist, and who's basically saying, why is it always that our language needs to be like your language? And what that is also a reflection of is the dehumanization of people who are deaf and or disabled, right? And using them as props so often, and using them as metaphors for, you know, enabled characters learning or something of that nature. And that's also why with the anthology Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back, which came out with 9 Arches 2 years ago, co-edited by myself, Sandra Allen, and Daniel Sluman. All of us are disabled editors. All the people in it all the contributors are deaf and or disabled, so it's not a relative of, it's not a friend of writing about it, it's actually us writing about whatever we want. You don't have to write about the experience of being deaf and or disabled, but it was really important for us that it was multilingual, that there are links under as many poems as we could get underneath each poem, even in the print version, to an audio reading of each poet performing it. And then it's also multilingual in the sense that short films in British Sign Language or captioned are also part of this anthology. So to speak about, to speak of translating, let's say, from text to images as also a form of interlingual translating, which I think is really important. And that also widens our understanding of translation. So it's not just widening access, but widening people's views of what counts as translation, what counts as literary translation, what should we disseminate and in what forms, and how do we get the funding, which is really important for all of us to do this, and sustain these really difficult careers and make kids more interested in this. And I was just really touched by what you said about the kids who, you know, wouldn't even admit to speaking their languages because there's so much pressure to conform, especially among disabled communities, I think, to write and speak English a certain way, to perceive how we move through the world as impediments or not languages in their own right, and not literary. So yeah, I mean, I would love more poetry prizes to include sign language poems, you know, just that, for instance, you know, to have submissions not just be text, but send in a video that's, you know, in translation, because that automatically counts. So With Care is about that.
Something to think about, lots to think about. Thank you. So we've discussed the present, which is needs work. Can we talk about the future, Charlotte? The translators of tomorrow, who are they from the work that you've been doing?
Yes. So my impression over the past 10 years that I've been involved in this world is that language-wise, it is getting better. And in some ways, so with my kind of German translation hat on, in some ways that's been to the detriment of like what I've been trying to do with German translation, because it's just become much more diverse in a really nice way. And German just isn't very diverse. But on the socioeconomic side, I think that's a much harder nut to crack. And I mean, it's like coming at it from the education perspective, which as you've noticed, I do quite a lot. I think there needs for there to be a change in socioeconomic backgrounds of those who feel that literary translation is for them. There needs to be systemic change. Well, there needs to be a whole attitude change in the UK in terms of how we view languages. We're working on it, but also the kind of systemic change within education in terms of how, like the role of MFL, modern foreign languages, and EAL, English as an additional language, within education, in order to raise the value of those languages and the idea of being bilingual. I mean, I have so many conversations with teachers now who talk about their pupils being embarrassed to admit that they speak another language, that they might or new arrivals coming in at the age of 6 and being really excited when they're asked about what other languages they have, and sharing words with their peers and so on, and then by the age of 11 absolutely shutting down when it's mentioned and not wanting even acknowledge it as was in that quote. And you know, that is terribly sad, and surely something that we can change. But it's a big change. And if our general attitude to languages in the UK continues as it is, then it's no surprise that it's only a certain elite that feels that they should have access to this quite esoteric activity.
I think that ties into my last question, which is, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, I'm not afraid to admit. And I found a quote from Marta, who is the editor of Kitchen Table Translation, which I mentioned before. She said, if you're having this big translation party, it involves opening the doors so that more people can come to the party. But the party has to change too. So my last question is, what would be helpful? What would be a helpful change? Let's start with a change. Let's start with one that the translation party would have to affect.
I'll submit one, and
yes,
I can dish into the ones.
Yes,
just one. This is something I tried to remember. It's really difficult, also. But when you're working with fixed categories of infrastructure, let's say mentorship, what are the assumptions that are brought to that table about where the mentee comes from and what knowledge? Because even as teachers and students, if anybody's taught, they know it's always a two-way street. And as teachers, you learn so much from students, right? And it's always this actually equitable exchange, hopefully. I would ask mentorship schemes or schemes that aim to include, say, people from the global south or what have you, to really examine the assumptions that may be there, that the people being mentored don't have really fascinating and important contextual knowledge to share as well, and to give them more of a platform to share about that.
Great.
Kareem? I think it's partly the onus is on the translators and the people who are trying to promote translation, as well as the institution. So I think the biggest thing for me is the two sides being open to creative solutions. So for example, we already mentioned, you have a mentorship scheme where you have non-language specific category. At the American University in my hometown in Suleimania, they have a workshop where the poetry teacher is an American writer who speaks very little Kurdish, but she has a whole class of students who are nearly fluent in English and Kurdish. And together, through their workshops, they have translated an anthology of Kurdish classical poetry. So that's just one way of doing it. And the other thing is, obviously, in conjunction with this, is that the industry, whether the publishing industry, the translation community, they need to change as well. And hopefully, the gatekeepers, if you like, won't be as narrow-minded and restrict as they have been so far. Yeah.
Anything to add?
I think that the party shouldn't always be in London. And if it is, it should be live streamed. I mean, maybe that. And also the people at the party and the people working at the party should be fairly remunerated, and you know, what work is involved in the party should be acknowledged, not just the kind of what you see, but all the work in between. And I mean, that's something we haven't talked about that much, but it's a big. I think it's, you know, on the socio-economic side, it's a really big problem in terms of who actually can make it as a literary translator.
Well, we'll get there. So we have 1 minute left. I guess we have 5. Okay, 2 questions maybe. Does anybody have a question? Hello.
It's not so much a question.
Could I define a question to a room full of translators?
What I wanted to say mostly was thank you to Oka for pointing out I mean, you know, as translators, we always say translation is always about making choices. That's the fundamental craft. But sometimes we can sort of pass the buck of responsibility to the author to say, oh, well, he said that word, so I've got to reproduce that word, when actually we have a choice and we can go back to the author and go, I don't know if that's going to work in English, can I change this a little bit? And yeah, I feel slightly more empowered to do that now.
It's hard. It's really difficult to do that. So yeah.
That really was more of a comment than a question.
I'm sorry, really,
I thought you were joking. A question, please. Thank you, Ruth. A question. Any other questions? I wish that we could have. We don't have a question on Twitter. We don't have a hashtag, do we? Ooh, maybe next time, right?
How are you going to train the readers to want to read the work you're talking about?
Training.
Well, I mean, I suppose this is what I'm thinking about with, for example, the International Book Club that I'm running, which is a very, very tiny thing. But the idea behind that is, as I said, that it's about like I don't think we're looking for a whole new set of readers. I think we need to re-educate the readers that we have to be more open and, you know, and to discover all this amazing literature, and that it's not, you don't have to be scared if you can't figure out how to pronounce the name of any of the characters and that kind of thing.
Or the name of the author.
Or the name of the author, yeah. And so I think it's about like finding where the readers are and then appealing to them in a range of ways. There was a very good round table discussion last week about that was run by English Pen and National Centre for Writing partly about International Translation Day, and that's a really I think that's a really good opportunity to create something that's more public facing for International Translation Day, as a way of doing that, as a way of raising the profile of international literature, in the way that, for example, World Book Day has been great for literature as a whole. But then there is the big question about labels, and do we want to be kind of siloing everything into this is literature in translation, or this is foreign literature, or this is like the table in the bookshop that gets those books, or do we just want to be joining the conversation about great literature, regardless of where it's from?
Could I just add something to that? Okay. I just want to think, as translators, I think we are often very undervalued in how much we can talk to readers. And my experience has been that, in fact, when I do get this chance to speak to the people who are reading the works that I produce, they're fascinated, they want more, they're dying to know something about it. And this kind of negativity, which sometimes seems to come from publishers, of saying, well, no, nobody's interested, readers don't want that kind of thing. It doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. Readers are interested. So that's my experience.
Can you just
everybody
add
loves translating. When they get the opportunity to translate, everybody loves it. Everybody loves it.
And the more translators, the more readers.
Just to add to that point, last year I found out by chance that the novel that I translated has been chosen as part of a political science program at one of the American universities, and the professor wanted to talk to me about the process, and he said what he does when he teaches the Middle East, he will bring 10 modern novels from the Middle East, and he'll ask the students, you are free to choose one of the books, but you need to write a paper about it. The book that I translated was 500 pages, so 250,000 words, on average twice all the other books. And he said, I thought American students very unfamiliar with reading in translation, but 1/3 of the class chose that book because they looked at it and they saw something that they could somehow relate to, or they were interested in it. So I think we make a lot of, not we, the publishing world, makes a lot of assumptions about what you can feed the readers. And it's a vicious circle, really. Unless you feed children different type of food, they're not going to eat it. But if you are not ever going to, to offer them, how would you know if they are going to go for it? So it just, we need to break that cycle. And I think there have been some progress, even like you look at TV now, you can see subtitled Scandinavian drama at prime time. Like 10 years ago, that was a no-no. So things are, I think, changing slowly, but we just need more of that, I think.
Yeah, and I also think that in terms of labeling, as you mentioned, you know, foreign or literature and translation, what's really fascinating is that it seems like a lot of our projects work with how we use language within the United Kingdom, right? There's so many. I recently heard somebody say to me, "Oh, you know, in England we only have one language." And like, you live in London? I don't understand. You know, so I mean, the opportunity for maybe, you know, one of your students to write in another language from here, or, you know, to not say this is foreign, but actually this is also the UK is what it is.
I'm really sorry. I think we have to wrap up. But I think the lesson here is that it's up to all of us to diversify the menu on offer. And I think we all have our own role in doing that. Please join me in thanking Kareem, Oka, and Charlotte for today's panel.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you.